Good evening and welcome to the Freedom News Review, first one for 2025. I'm Freedom Editor Uri Gordon, joined by Simon from Freedom Press, and we're going to have a little look at, the news that is beginning to shape the new year. Of course, we're still with our eyes on Gaza, with our eyes on Rojava, with our eyes on the U.S., but we've also got some domestic news developing, so we're going to have a little look at these for you. Um, we also want to use this perhaps as an invitation. Yeah, if you are an anarchist commentator, you want to come on here as a guest. We're looking for more people to participate in this, so just drop us a line to editor@freedompress.org.uk. And yeah, I find you can be on here next time, like they say. All right. Well, we'll kick off with kind of New Year's Eve news, the various New Year's Eve traditional solidarity actions that have been taking place across borders in solidarity this year, marking especially solidarity with Greek comrades. Um, as we have been reporting about the Ambelakopiko Kipoi case, in which Greek anarchist Kyriakos Ximitiris was killed in an explosion in an Athens flat. And that led to a series of arrests in Greece of anarchist comrades with or without substantive evidence tying them to anything in particular. And so these kind of arrests in Greece were the theme, if you like, of this year's New Year's Eve solidarity demos across outside prisons in Europe. These took place both in Greece, where in the famous Piraeus prison of Korydallos, where Mariana, Dimitra, Nikos Romanos, and other captives are being held. There was a massive crowd stops both in front of the men and women's prisons, hanging banners, chanting from the outside, the usual sort of red or other colored flares lighting. Also outside the infamous Moabit prison in Berlin, outside a prison in Hungary, as well as here in the UK, we've had already word of demos outside Brixton, outside of in the Pentonville prison. All of these have seen traditional New Year's Eve prisoner solidarity noise demos. This year also marking solidarity with the comrades arrested in Greece. Over to you, Simon.
Yeah, I was also another one worth mentioning was that there was a noise demo at HMP Polmont in Scotland, which is there are occasional demos sort of outside of London, Brixton and Pentonville being the ones which sort of happen sort of every year. But it's good to see more demos happening sort of around the country. Generally, I think
Absolutely, we're talking about the demonstration that gathered on New Year's Eve outside HMP Polmont in Scotland, where Madeleine Norman, a Palestine Action political prisoner, is being detained. She's been on remand since August, for actions against Elbit, and these are a group of activists that have been targeting the Filton site of Elbit, and they're not due to even go on trial until November. So they're right now being held on remand for a very long period, and I'm sure that there's a great appreciation for those prison demos happening outside there. And yeah, I mean, this is the current situation where increasing clampdown on nonviolent action is taking place. The government has begun essentially sending people down for nonviolence. In these situations, it becomes all more important, I think, that people are not isolated, that people know that they have that support on the outside, and that people have the sense that if they take the risk to do the right thing, then they will have that, both the legal and social support that is needed to go through that process. So one of those kind of, I guess, little beams of light that we can take with us into a 2025 that, if anything, I think we can expect to be marked quite negatively by various, um, how shall we say, unsavory personalities, whether they are in the United States or here domestically. And here we found this Trump, Musk, Farage tried, especially entertaining in the past week, I
Well,
guess.
yes. Although one thing, just to quickly go back to the prison a bit before
Go ahead.
moving on. So one of the good things, or one of the good things, one of the necessary things, I suppose, that's happened as a result of many more people being in prison, is that obviously there's more families and more comrades who get involved with supporting them. What this has also led to is essentially a decent listings service for who political prisoners are connected to these things. So I would punt people in the way, and I'll probably put this in the show notes, towards rebelsinprison.uk, which has a full list of, everyone from Roger Hallam to Sean Middlesbrough to George Simpson and all the rest. And there's various kind of campaigns which are sort of getting going. Defend Our Juries is another one, who are starting to list out who these people are, how they can be contacted and supported. And I think one of the things which we probably will see over the course of the next year, particularly because Starmer doesn't seem to be letting up on the whole, we should be sending these people down for long periods, even though there's a prisons crisis, is that, yeah, like these groups are going to need more support. There's obviously a background in the anarchist movement of the Anarchist Black Cross, which has been lesser supported in recent years, I think, which could probably do with being rejuvenated and sorted out again. But
Absolutely.
yeah, at some point we probably should do an article, I think, listing where these new services are, who's who, and how people can get
Yeah,
more
well,
directly
at
involved.
this we can already promise something for next week that rounds up those resources in view of these New Year's demos, and we can also try and include some of that already in the show notes for tonight. Um, Anarchist Black Cross, of course, as we know, still groups quite strong and active in places like Dresden, places like Belarus, more of Eastern European focus these days, but certainly that kind of banner that has space for revival right now. Okay, well, shall we go then over to the right wing shit show, which is much more
Sure.
fun? Well, I
It
mean,
is.
that's
It's
the
been
thing,
very
it's
entertaining.
said about the story is told about the person who goes into a shop, haggles loudly, pays over the price, and goes out without the merchandise. And that seems to be the case of what happened to Nigel Farage this week, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. I mean, it's a certain. There's been a certain bit in the liberal media, particularly saying, "Oh, well, I think this may turn out quite well for Farage because he gets to present himself as a man of principle who turned down Musk." It's like, well, he didn't turn down Musk, though. I mean, what he did was essentially, well, he said outright at the Reform conference that Musk was a hero, and he was very happy to have Musk's support and all that kind of stuff. And then made a few mutterings to say, well, we don't necessarily agree with him on everything all the time, but which is not the same thing as saying he's 100% wrong about Tommy Robinson and should wind his neck in. It's not standing up to the man, it's waffling and kind of this mendacious, not really, which is the sort of thing which, so I was going to say UKIP, which Reform UK and Farage have always been solidly against. They've always been the sorts of people who tell it how it is, and they're blunt, and they never step down for a challenge and all this kind of stuff. And clearly, it's nonsense when there's $100 million on the line. So yeah,
Yeah,
at
I
the
mean,
moment,
what's so weird is that Musk seems to be sort of playing his fascism card, with vigor these days. First, the open support for AfD in Germany, now saying, okay, I'll support Farage, but well, if they prevaricate, they'll support Tommy Robinson, outright fascist. What next? Maybe he's going to be funding Andrew Tate's new party of the humiliated by pizza delivery ringleaders. It's not clear what's going on.
Yeah,
What
I don't. I mean,
is Musk just this man child who's playing around with his money with no actual care for in the world?
I think he's genuinely succumbed to the brain rot. I saw a thing earlier today. Someone had listed the time and basic content of every tweet that he'd done in the previous 24 hours, and uh, he'd done almost 11 hours straight, posting every couple of minutes, sort of thing. Like this, he seems to have gotten himself so um, continually latched into sort of Twitter and the online space. I, I was sort of looking at it and thinking, well, could he maybe be getting some loon spud or other to be posting for him? But it's all in his sort of ballpark.
Well, I
It's all
mean,
the
he's
sort of
probably
thing which you
talking
expect
and
him to
someone's
say.
vigorously typing after him or something like that, right? But every little
Yeah,
brain fart just gets posted.
but even if he's just posting interesting, everything he posts, he has to have been reading someone else's tweet or, sort of
Mm.
engaging in some way with the content. He doesn't strike me as someone who just sort of would leave his account for some rando to post from. But what it means is he's clearly not doing his job. He's clearly not, engaging with
I mean,
the
11
multiple
hours is clearly
businesses.
not doing very well either. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it strikes me as the actions of someone who is, I'm not going to say mentally unwell, but certainly struggling with mental health in some way.
mhm.
Because, that level of obsessive behavior is, if it was anyone else doing it, you'd have an intervention. Or maybe, I mean, maybe his friends are trying and he's just not listening to them.
Who
But if he's the
knows?
sort of guy who responds to the absolute milquetoast efforts of Farage with "let's depose Farage," then it doesn't sound like he's in a headspace for people to be saying, maybe knock this on the head a bit, mate. It's not good for you.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
part of it is just the whimsical behavior of the ultra rich, right? I mean, you can see sort of with Trump similar dynamics where, you simply get used to having very little consequences personally for what you say or do. There are a lot of consequences for other people, which is, that part. But then there's also, I mean, a lot of reports about his slightly unhinged behavior. And you start getting worried, what is the dynamic between that shit show and the real nasty stuff that we're about to start getting out of the United States come 20th of January. And I'm talking about the various, Stephen Millers and others in the administration that will be pushing forward very coldly with, cruel and unusual ways of hurting the people of whatever citizenship. So to me, this kind of takes me back to a little bit to what Chomsky already said, back in 2016 about Trump, that he's actually, he's a con man, but ultimately he's the distraction, right? And it's the right wing congressmen and senators and legislators that are pushing through, basically dismantling whatever is still left of things like the Environmental Protection Agency, any hope of curtailing carbon emissions from the state side, and that's certainly something to worry about.
well, not just them either. I mean, one of the things which has popped up today, obviously, is Mark Zuckerberg doing his big thing of changing the ethos of Facebook so that it will all of a sudden be allowed to do politics again. And they're getting rid of, um, controls over what people can say about sort of the levels of racism and sexism and transphobia and anti-queer stuff. Not that he ever went away, but, he's clearly sending a message out that it's the far right is now open for business again on all of his platforms. Like at one point, he's hired Dana White as like a senior Facebook director now. And if you don't know who Dana White is like UFC boss. Like he's his previous job was essentially trying to stop Conor McGregor from screwing up too badly
Well,
on
I mean,
fight
the
night.
new American Secretary of Education is also connected to the wrestling world. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
this is in fashion these days.
What they have in common is that they're sort of mates with Trump, and it's not just going to be Facebook doing this. Getting rid of protections and it's sort of re-engaging with the far right and all the rest of it. It's going to be a lot of different companies. It's going to be Disney. It's going to be pretty much the whole of big tech are going to start doing this sort of thing. The financial sector are going to stop doing even the kind of uh, weak symbolic stuff that they've been doing on things like diversity hires and all that kind of stuff. All of this is going to go out the window because these firms are looking at the way the wind is blowing and saying, well, we're going to engage with the rising far right in US politics, right?
Yeah, I
Even
mean,
though
we
they're in.
thought we might have some respite from the right wing wave, but we're still about halfway through it at the very least. And it looks like, with the winds blowing from both the United States, the Middle East, Russia, China, this is still kind of, yeah, moving into an authoritarian direction, and the direction that, we will have to counter either in part, right, with our own forms of media. And I hope that, we've seen in a way that kind of block and forget attitude of, yeah, not trying to pretend that there is any kind of even playing field or public civic space in which these kind of engagement can happen, because they are not fair term engagements and not good faith engagements. And on the other hand, perhaps also some kind of a revival of face-to-face work that, social media, before it became so thoroughly shitified, has felt like it's swept away in the last 15 to 20 years. Both of those things might be positive outcomes of this situation, but I think you're right. There's no doubt that people are taking a cue from existing impunities essentially and moving on. Now, question is whether things will also push forward in terms of the increases in face-to-face work, and the type of covert actions that we've seen increasing as the political space closes gradually for public action and for, yeah, accountable types of protest. Um, any more on this that we should cover? I mean, what does that tell us going back to the UK? I mean, we saw Starmer a little bit sort of pushing back against Musk, but it appears that overall, both on a policy level and much of the rhetoric level on immigration, for example, Labour is still somehow playing to the right wing, even after it won the elections.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I mean, on a foreign policy basis, Starmer is very much in the same mold as Blair ever was, or Cameron, or indeed any British Prime Minister over the last 40, 50 years, is that he's going to make an accommodation with Trump. They all pride themselves on being constructive engagers with whatever the status quo might be. It's very likely that Starmer will make a certain splash in terms of rhetorically saying, well, Musk is not in charge, possibly making the calculation that at some point Trump and Musk will be Splitsville. But yeah, I don't see him doing anything that will actually stand up to any of the far right agenda. And I would imagine that quite a lot of the social policies that he brings forward are going to be, at the very least, kind of hedging bets. I mean, they already do to a great degree, with policy directly. It's quite likely that we'll see either a stasis or a mild extension, I would imagine, of repressive approaches towards particularly protesters and progressives in Britain. But mostly fairly stably status quo, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that Starmer and the Labour government at this point is mostly focused on playing responsible adult in the room within NATO come January 20th, and their engagement on that level. So domestically, there is that, continued accommodation of the far right, whereas they're trying internationally to will probably try to, well, it depends, right? It depends what we get in Germany with the next election as well. Um, it depends what we get in France before long. I mean, the far right there has been thwarted for now, but yeah, we'll just tell our listeners who haven't noticed that Jean-Marie Le Pen died today. That might be or was announced dead today. Yeah, very sad. Not sad for us, but these kind of landmarks occasion us to think about whether France also, the far right threat in France hasn't really gone anywhere. And these are still essentially the same populations to whom the Labour and Social Democrats have nothing left to offer. They can't offer them, the usual previous promises, jobs, welfare. They can't even offer them much by way of national security. When you see so much, there's actually a constant regime of insecurity going on. We're kept being told about cyber attacks, about new pandemics, with the looming possibility of an escalation of essentially of this low intensity or medium intensity World War III that we are already inside, with various kind of folk in the world. And so it becomes the deal for previously social democratic governments that all they have is also to tell people that, at least we're protecting you from those outsiders who are coming to kind of get what's left of our goodies, right? And here is also where, this longer term trajectory of climate collapse, of refugee crisis, of desertification comes to the fore. And I guess this is the point where we can also talk about the longer term visions that have been coming out of southeastern Mexico in the past weeks. And this is an item that we'll just talk about briefly because we'll feature it tomorrow and we don't want too many spoilers. But basically, the Zapatistas are expecting the fall of capitalism within 7 generations. That's kind of the headline that's coming out of their meetings for the last year and more. On a local level, we're talking here about an international gathering, the first sort of session of the International Meetings of Rebellions and Resistance 2024-25, which the EZLN is convening. This first session took place in Oventic, Zapatista community in southeast Mexico. On the local level, this is happening against the background of a kind of more decentralized structure for the Zapatista communities that has been introduced over the past year and in resistance to sort of intensified attacks on their communities involving both kind of government, state forces, the gangs that are connected to narco trafficking across the Guatemalan border, and incursions by transnational corporations in terms of logging and the rest of it. And here, their idea of managing land in common, of equality and community relations is something that is put forward as the counter proposal to the current sort of politics of extractivism and conflict. And then there was a talk given by formerly Subcomandante Marcos, now going as Insurgent Captain Marcos El Capitan. The talk was titled "The Watchtower: Signs Towards Tomorrow." And there was a message sort of directed towards European activists to reflect on this 7 generation or 120-year scenario where, we need to prepare as capitalism falls and, brings down much of industrial civilization with it. What kind of communities are we building today that are going to be able to, provide for life, essentially? And life means land, it means water, it means relationships, it means energy, it means food. All of these systems are ones that we cannot rely on capitalism to keep sustaining. It may sustain them, decreasingly for the richest part of the population, but it is certainly already proven itself unable to provide anything like the prosperity that it promises. And so, we'll just update about like this series of reflections and narratives that Marcus has been publishing basically since October, that have been, under this title of the storm and the storm in the day after. The storm in the day after, this idea of talking about something that is actually a prolonged process, but being able to anticipate that, stuff that green anarchists have been talking about for easily 20 or 30 years, and that the Zapatistas have also, been quite open to for a long time. I think is high time that, activists in the West also treat that with the seriousness it deserves. Although, of course, doing that from the point of view of an indigenous community in southeastern Mexico that has already achieved a degree of autonomy is quite different from thinking about those futures from the point of view of ourselves in the global north.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a very different kettle of fish when you have a defined um, regional zone, which you are administrating, as opposed to in Britain, you've got a situation where we struggle to coalesce on a single street, or on a in a small community, let alone controlling it in that kind of sense. We have such a well-established proprietarian system in Britain that it can seem a huge hurdle that we struggle to or can't overcome, because the squatting movement has been curtailed strongly by aggressive legislation and police intervention. Building cooperatives up is very expensive now, because obviously renting a shop or owning a building is a huge continual drain on trying to run something like that. Um, we have a very limited infrastructure and amount of uh, people with experience who are able to kind of pass that all on and get new things going. It's a huge task, I think, in the sense of certainly British organising, to look at something like the Zapatistas, what the Zapatistas have got, and say, well, maybe can we establish something similar here? Like the idea of taking over a large area of land and calling it ours and running it. It's not impossible, but there's a huge amount of stuff in the way to establish anything along those lines. I think one of the things which we, I mean, one of the things we certainly can do in the initial stage is to sort of say, well, okay, so if you're talking about the slow collapse of capitalism over multiple generations, we can kind of say with a certain degree of confidence roughly what is going to happen in Europe over the next generation, certainly, which is the climate is going to become hotter in sort of Spain and the Mediterranean areas. It's going to move agriculture northwards. It's going to push vast numbers of climate refugees into those areas. It's going to essentially incentivize the EU to, and Britain as a corollary, to turn turn Fortress Europe into a severely militarized zone, probably a violent and murderous one, far more than we're seeing on the seas today, in order to kind of counter the perceived danger that such migration brings. We will almost certainly see, because of the continuing increasing lopsidedness of where capital sits, an ongoing worsening of the situation where ownership of land stops us from organizing and doing things in an unalienated or a less alienated way. And that's going to cause continual and ongoing and increasing social crisis, probably with violence and social rebellion as a corollary. How that social rebellion manifests itself at the moment is leaning in a more fascist direction. And obviously our biggest task is to stop that from happening. We really don't have many advantages in doing so. But in terms of how we respond to or start thinking about how our specific circumstances map onto what the Zapatistas are talking about, we've got a different task from defending something that we've already got to a great degree. I think we've got a task of um, being diffuse in a society which doesn't allow us to a great degree to hive ourselves off into bespoke units like that. Um,
Yeah, I think that's certainly right. I mean, I think we need to really, from the perspective of Britain, appreciate how on the other end of the spectrum we are to Chiapas in terms of just social structures of solidarity and community relations. Which, you talked about squatting, you talked about cooperatives. It was already, 50 years ago that Thatcherism began its sustained project of dismantling, what were already existing and thriving working class communities and community structures and infrastructures in this country. And it is, only with and now the scaffolding that social movements have tried to create in order to move on past that are also under attack. So, this is first of all this social task of trying to work against the extreme atomization and alienation that British society has come to represent. And part of it is social networks substituting for face-to-face relations, but that's just a recent phenomenon that's sitting on top of a much more sustained neoliberal project of atomization, essentially, of turning each of us into a node that is not connected, that is not organized, which instead of real human connection gets this simulacrum through a social media that is, as we said before, increasingly open to fascist content. And then, of course, in the same way that Zapatista communities are still having to defend themselves against violence, in the same way, I think it will remain the task for radical activists in the North to prioritize solidarity on the ground with those who are being made most vulnerable by these excesses of the system. And we're talking about refugees on the outskirts, but and we're also talking about refugees and the most vulnerable within the metropole, within both urban and rural areas. I think part of the thing to consider, however, is that in Britain it's less the case, but there has been a massive sort of abandonment of rural areas in a lot of southern and Mediterranean Europe. Which means that, and with climate change, those are going to become more and more marginal lands, which is going to take both more labor and more know-how of the, drylands agriculture, clever permaculture systems, and so on, in order to deal with. So, in a way, there may also be, maybe in the later future, marginal regions of Europe that do become a bit more like Chiapas in the sense that the system has lost interest in them. They're not oil rich, they're not resource rich, and that might turn into some kind of counterbalance there. Where there might be that kind of new setup of both urban and rural collective structures that are also, trying to build something a bit more sustainable while still doing work with, that takes up the desires and the leadership of the most vulnerable in societies in the global north as well.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one that sort of talking about the depopulation of rural areas. This is happening in the UK as well to a degree, particularly in the north. But one of the one of the things which seems to be sort of happening through, particularly through neoliberal economics, automation, the kind of reduction of the ways in which you can be employed outside of major economic nodes, sort of big cities, successful um, economic areas, is that you see a general depopulation and a general sidelining, not just in rural areas, but also in urban ones to a great degree. So within London, for example, you can find if you follow the Thames out east, there are entire boroughs which are abandoned to a huge degree. You can walk through their town centres, and they are as abandoned as Rochdale is. They are abandoned as village greens are, and this kind of shoving of more and more people into the centre, essentially, has meant that it increases atomization and alienation within those centres, and it also means that you find it you can find it much more difficult to uh, engage with and become part of communities in those zones. One of the things which social media has made much easier, actually, famously, is that you find your communities online rather than offline. You don't know your neighbor, but you do know a dozen people in the US who share your
Hobby
um,
or whatnot. Yeah.
show. Um, And one of the things which, so actually, I was listening to the Final Straw Radio, great radio stream. I'd recommend it to people who don't listen to it. Interviewed Peter Geldloos recently. Geldloos was kind of talking in ways, also harking back to prison solidarity, sort of talking about the ways in which uh, we as a movement and the left in general, and not just the left, the right does it as well, can be quite, elements of it can be quite over the top in policing uh, the boundaries, the rhetorical boundaries, positions of our communities. So, for example, uh, prison solidarity is solidarity with all prisoners, but that means you're in solidarity with some of the worst people going, right? People who are like murderers and, you know, habitual footy thugs, fascists, indeed. Um, people who, if they were within communities that we lived in, there would be a tendency to try and oust them, for example. But the solidarity is the importance of the solidarity is the acknowledgement that we have a long way to go to push people who are very much not in our zone into areas where they can become or engage with constructive rebellion against the status quo and the system which has produced them, who's created them in the first place. And so sort of Peter Geldloos was sort of talking about this, and there's kind of a whole degree of conversation that seems to be going on about it at the moment, which is both good and bad in the way that it's being approached. I think one of the bad things about it is that it's taking place primarily as a result of the US elections and this kind of viewpoint that, oh, people didn't mind voting for a fascist, therefore woke is not important, or woke is a busted flush, and maybe ID poll is all the things that all of the um, more
Incels
conservatively minded
say it is.
people say that it is. Yeah, and I think that that is an error. I think that the rapprochement between, we need to have more uh, kindness and more understanding of how we are and who we are interacting with at any given time, and the fact that we don't know what people's backgrounds are and we don't know why they feel the way that they do, and we need to kind of talk through those kinds of things with people to try and understand them before we can improve matters and change things, is the important bit, not the wholesale rejection of what is actually quite an important thing, which is the what has led to woke and what has led to kind of the status quo that is currently collapsing, the social status, social of social progressivism, all the symbolic stuff which companies were doing. That was drawing on something very real, right? Like diversity and inclusion has often been done in very, symbolic, cack-handed ways, which sometimes can cause more problems than they solve. But that's not the fault of the idea. It's the fault of the, Fortune 500 CEO who is just doing it because
Well,
that's on the
exactly.
list, right?
I guess that's the problem with the Democratic Party and with the liberal take on, I just don't like to use the word woke, but like the whole liberal take on
It's
identity
incoherent
politics
as a
is
term.
that it's something that can be incorporated within the existing hierarchical system. Only if we talk to each other differently, I'll exploit you, but I'll talk to you differently. Um, I don't, I think that for anarchists, it's always been about bringing kindness or bringing the acknowledgement of multiple axes of domination into our class politics rather than it being a substitute for our class politics. But, I think it depends on where people start. Where and how people find their way through to these ideas, and certainly a big way, I think, for capitalism to neuter and weaken the notion of intersectionality and of resisting all forms of domination was to say, oh, well, we can be against racism and sexism without being against capitalism. Right? We can have a trans-inclusive corporation, despite it being a capitalist corporation, and this doesn't have to do really with structures of power. It just has to do with personal ideologies of bigotry, with education to, giving up prejudices, rather than with systemic change. And so really kind of the question is who is the target of any of these criticisms? Because when liberalism or the Democratic Party or the moderate center, the extreme center, if that's what you want to call it, is the target of those criticisms, then it's quite justified. But I think it always is just like needs to be re-emphasized that this is about that combination of all of that with previous notions of anti-capitalism, anti-militarism that have always been there. Anti-patriarchy and so on. But like anti-racism means anti-capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Being against transphobia, or caring about trans people being able to be who they are, means being against the state, because here we have the state curtailing people's access to resources, people's access to identity, if you will, as a matter of force and violence.
I mean, you
And
see,
so
you
it
see,
is
you
it
see
is
this.
that connection that we're looking for, of course.
Yeah, I mean, you see this weaponization going on all the time. So, in one case, you might have the zero sum prospect of money going to, oh, does money go to women's shelters, or does it go to helping trans people, or does it go to minority groups, or does it go, and it's like, well,
It goes to
that's,
Trident usually, but yeah.
yeah, and usually goes straight. But the posing of that competition between differing groups is a fundamental of capitalism, and it's this idea that we're all competing against each other in different modes in that sense, that directly helps capitalism. There's actually a really good critique. I disagreed with a lot of their conclusions, but a group called the IWCA, the Independent Working Class Association, came out of Red Action. They wrote a long piece years and years ago talking about how Blairism took the concept of multiculturalism and ran with it. And it kind of took the surface level idea of lots of cultures all rubbing along together and getting along because, why wouldn't you, given the opportunity? And it does happen in, on estates and in local communities all over the country and around the world, and then saying, right, well, actually, what multiculturalism is Tower Hamlets has a big Muslim community, so we're going to select someone as the representative of the Tower Hamlets Muslim community, and that person is going to be the guy that we continually listen to, which then empowers some,
Politician,
loudmouth,
essentially.
ambitious, big ego, New Labour apparatchik to become the voice of Muslims in Tower Hamlets. Completely irrelevant as to whether this person is liked in Tower Hamlets, even. Um, and they then start pitching themselves as, I am, getting resources for Muslims in Tower Hamlets, and it becomes, what is supposed to be a multiculturalism of Tower Hamlets has lots of different peoples all over from lots of different places who happen to live there. Becomes a competition between, oh well, the Muslims in Tower Hamlets are the thing which characterizes Tower Hamlets, and they are organizing to get the resources. And this is a fundamental, deliberate breaking down of class unity under those circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think, as we will see, yeah, whether it is fascism or the left that manages to more successfully take advantage of the reaction to this social decimation. I think there are signs that the younger people are, the less patience they have statistically and overall for this kind of hate mongering. But again, this is going to depend on us. I tend to be a bit optimistic about having won the main kind of mainstay of the cultural fight in the last decades. But again, those achievements can be erased, just like the right to abortion.
Yeah,
And
and
so
I
we
think
shall.
I think the important one of the important things for us, and in large part our engagement with the left, I think, will be to stop people from swinging all the way through to a rejection of listening to minority groups, essentially, and then going back to the old rubbish thing of sidelining people and saying, "Oh well, we'll do that after the revolution," because that was always rubbish, and it, for years, decades, got in the way um, rather than helping anything. Like Cranwick, it took too long to for people to latch onto. Oh, this is a major class struggle, not just some random brown people getting
Absolutely.
angry. And women fighting for rights as well was infamously in the 70s was dismissed by male shop stewards up and down the country, and had to be consistently fought for so that the people were just to be taken seriously. And we can't go back to that shit. That was nonsense. And yeah, like we need to be able to take a take a step back before re-entering that kind of phase.
Absolutely. Well, on that cautionary note, I think we should close our uh, Freedom News review for today. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Freedom Editor Rick Gordon, joined today by Simon from Freedom Press. Check us out, freedomnews.org.uk, freedompress.org.uk for the shop. We're on Blue Sky, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. Coming soon, Freedom on the Moon. Good night, everybody.